Okay. So the live has just started, sir.
All right.
So could we please wait for at least 1 or 2 minutes, 2 minutes, so that the audience comes in, right? And just
Are you going to do an introduction or do I start immediately?
So I will introduce you
Okay.
very briefly, like in 2-3 minutes, and
Yes,
then
absolutely.
okay, so I'm just eagerly waiting for the audience to just join in. Just give me, could you just wait for a minute? শাগনিক, আমি এটা শেয়ার করছি, তুই একবার একটু শেয়ার করে দিস। হ্যাঁ, আমি ভিডিওটা
no
শেয়ার
problem.
করলাম ফেসবুকে, আমি শেয়ার করে দিচ্ছি, তুই জাস্ট একটু শেয়ার করে দে, তাহলে সুবিধা হবে, তাহলে লোকজন আসতে। Okay, I think the audience has started to come in, and আর একটা হচ্ছে, আচ্ছা, লোকজন আসছে, আরেকটা কি না, ছোট ছোট
We can begin now.
হ্যাঁ, জাস্ট 1 মিনিট শাকনিক, 1 মিনিট। Okay. So I will just take a minute before I hand over to Shagnik. So friends, welcome to our 15th webinar session of A-ANANDA Group of Contemporary Studies. It is our pleasure and honor to have with us today Professor Patrick Olivelle, the Professor of Emeritus at the Pennsylvania State University, at the Pennsylvania University, sorry, and
University of Texas.
University of Texas, University of Texas. I beg your pardon. It's University of Texas, and I'm elated. We're elated. We're ecstatic that Sir has agreed to deliver a lecture in our webinar sessions. So before going to Shagnik, I would like to make two things clear. First, the entire video of today's webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and secondly, after Sir delivers his lecture, you can post your questions or comments in the comment section box. So without any further delay, Shagnik.
Thank you, Nobonil. It is a matter of greatest privilege for me to moderate this 15th webinar session of A-ANANDA Group of Contemporary Studies with our esteemed speaker this evening, none other than Professor Patrick Olivelle, a doyen of South Asian Studies. I'm really thankful to A-ANANDA Group of Contemporary Studies and my friend Nobonil for making me a part of this. Currently Professor Emerita at University of Texas, Patrick Olivelle is a much familiar name to the students and scholars of South Asian religion, literature, and early Indian history in general. To summarize the career of and academic ventures as monumental as his is a daunting task in itself. However, in and beyond the scope of discipline, his critical and wide-ranging works have been engaging with diverse sets of readers interested in varied and larger themes of law, statecraft and trade, bodies, gender relations, and non-humans, in his own words, making the familiar unfamiliar to them. His exemplary scholarship encompasses the enormous range from Upanishads to Dharma and Niti literature to Ashwaghosha in Sanskrit, which encompasses almost 5 to 6 critical editions that includes Manava Dharma Shastra, Yagnavalkya Dharmashastra, and Vaishnava Dharmashastra. He has received American Academy of Religions Award for excellence in the study of religion in the historical category for his book The Asrama System in 1994, and Association of Asian Studies A.K. Ramanujan Translation Award in 1998 for his seminal works on the Upanishad. He has edited some of the major works in history in the volumes on reimagining Ashoka, memory and history, recently Hindu law, a new history of the Dharmashastra, gṛhastha, the householder in ancient Indian religious culture, and these are really essential to reinterpret the early Indian history. So, sir, without any further delay, I would ask you to kindly, take over. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I hope all of you can hear me. And thank you for that very generous introduction, Sagnik. So today I'm going to talk to you all more about how to do history and the pitfalls of doing history, especially when that history is of an ancient period, 2000 years or more ago, when sources to reconstruct that history are either lacking or very meager. And when they are available, especially in written form, such as the Buddhist scriptural texts, the Jain scriptural texts, and very large corpus of Brahmanical texts going from the Vedic period down to the Dharmashastras. Even when we have those sources, we have to be cognizant of the fact that these texts do not aim to write history. They are done for a different purpose. They are addressed at their contemporary society and people, and they aim to do something very different from the modern task of writing history. So we are using these texts that were intended for one purpose to do something very different. So we have to be cognizant of that and not accept what is given in these texts at face value as representing social reality. Social reality is something we have to construct. It's not something that is a given. So this is the central task of a historian, and the historians need to have a very large dose of humility to recognize that what we do not know is much larger than what we do know, and to let our audience know when we do not know something or when what we present may not be the actual reality. So the hypothesis, the tentativeness of what we do. So we have to be cognizant of that and let our audience know it. Many of the sources we have come from a religious background, and therefore they often present a religious ideology than a social description or a sociology. Another point that I want to emphasize, and I have done this, Sagnik talked about what I have written, and if I read them, then what I say today will be old hat, something that you already know. But I want to emphasize is that we have to be also cognizant of the value of silencers, what I call silencers. That is, what texts do not say is often as important to construct a sociology, a social history, than what they actually say. Right? And as I have said in some of my writings, in scholarship, familiarity breeds acceptance. In other words, when we are so familiar with something, when something has been repeated for the last 150 years, we have read it in text, we have seen it in the textbooks we have read as young people or even as adults, we tend to accept it as common sense. And this was true in my case too. In my case, my history over the last around 50 years now has been one of unlearning, making the familiar unfamiliar, as I say, and challenging what I had over the years accepted. So with that, I will enter. Can you all see the first slide that I have? Sagnik, can you see the slide? Everybody can see the slide?
Sir, not yet. So,
Okay.
yes, right
Now,
now we can see. Yeah.
okay, now, yeah. Let's keep it at that. They don't need to see my face. Yeah. Okay, so here is something that is very common, and you may have seen this. I'm quoting from Gavin Flood, a very good scholar teaching at Oxford, a friend of mine, and he has written a wonderful book called Introduction to Hinduism. And he says there, the Vedic society was divided into 4 classes: the Brahmins, the nobles, warriors, or Kshatriya, commoners, Vaishya, and serfs, Sudra. The top 3 classes being called twice born, dvija, because boys underwent an initiation or upanayana. Okay, so this is something that is often found in many textbooks on Hinduism or Indian culture or about ancient India. Let me give a second quote, and that is from this wonderful book, now over half a century old, by Professor A.L. Basham, The Wonder That Was India. Professor Basham was the teacher of our own Romila Thapar, and he says there, a sharp distinction was made between the 3 higher classes and the Shudra. The former were twice born dvija, once at their natural birth and again at their initiation, upanayana, when they are invested with a sacred thread and received into Aryan society. Now I want to ask you all to look at these, think about these 2 very commonly stated views and see if there is something wrong here. Is this true? Are they representing historical, social, religious reality or something else? Think about it a little bit. They are giving the varṇa system, the 4 varnas, as a foundational structure of ancient Indian society. The question is that true? Or is it true in the way it has been formulated? And then they make a second assertion that 3 of these varnas, the Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya, are twice born or dvija. And Shudras and others who are at the bottom of this hierarchical social structure, these others have a single birth. They are not dvijas, and therefore are excluded from many of the ritual religion or even the social structures that constituted ancient Indian society. So these 2 central assertions that we find in many of the texts that we read, I want to ask you a question. Does that represent the reality of ancient India? In trying to answer that question, I think we need to understand or investigate what the basis for these statements are. What are the sources from which Gavin Flood and A.L. Basham constructs these statements about ancient Indian society? For the most part, and I should say almost exclusively, they come from Brahmanical texts, and especially the Dharma Shastras and perhaps the Sanskrit epics, especially the Mahabharata. So we find a description of society that is derived from texts produced by a particular elite class of society and a elite that is a small minority with some access to grind, some points to make, an ideology to present. So the issue is the Brahmanical description of social reality actually the social reality, or is it actually an ideological statement, a statement of what should be rather than what is? How do we check this? Is there a way in which we have whether check this out to see whether it is true or not? And that is very difficult because we have very few texts that come from outside of these religious texts. One source that we have, which is a precious source on which I have been working diligently for the last 10 years or so, has been the Ashokan inscriptions. Ashokan inscriptions were written on stone around the middle or a little after the middle of the 2nd century before Christ, right? Before the Common Era. And this is precious because we know more or less the exact time frame in which these were written, whereas for most of ancient Indian texts, we do not have that precision. And what is more, we have them in exactly the way they were written. For all of the other Indian texts, we have only manuscripts that were written 1,000 years after these texts were originally composed. So they have been written and rewritten and transcribed by scribes over and over again, introducing new things, leaving some things out, introducing errors, introducing additions. So we do not have it exactly the way they were actually written. Critical editions, in which I have participated, more than my fair share, attempts to reconstruct this ancient past, but that reconstruction is almost always an approximation because we do not have the original manuscript that the author wrote. Right? So this is the issue that we have, and then the importance of the Ashokan inscriptions. When we look at this rather large body of text that Ashoka wrote to his people, especially the 14 major rock inscriptions spread throughout the landscape of India, and the 7 pillar inscriptions mostly located in the northeastern area of India, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, that area. In all of this, we do not come across the word varna a single time. The varna ideology, that there are Indian society is divided into 4 varnas, is not recorded at all. The very terms Shudra, Vaishya, Kshatriya are absent. This is what I started out saying were the silencers that we have to pay attention to. If the varna system was so central to ancient Indian society, as the Dharmashastras say it was, then why was Ashoka silent on that? Ashoka's dharma, which was the central concept for Ashoka, consists principally in establishing proper relations between the self, that is myself, who is the subject of the dharma teaching, and other significant others, parents, relatives, friends, acquaintances, Brahmins as a religious group, ascetics, slaves, servants, animals. There's a whole web of relationships that define proper dharma. Wouldn't varna relationships be part of that if it was a central social concept? So this is the question one needs to ask. Why is there silence once you get out of the Brahmanical discourse? We have another text, 2 centuries, 3 centuries after Ashoka, Kautilya's Arthashastra, which of course we have come down to us in very mutilated fashion, only one full manuscript available. But what is important is that the audience of Kautilya was very different. It was the king and the court, royal court. Kautilya was probably a Brahmin, but a different sort of Brahmin who was in politics, so to speak. And although varna does occur in Kautilya, it plays a marginal role, and it plays almost no role in much of the text outside of the first book that deals with more or less philosophical matters. And what is more, the term Vaishya occurs also in the first book, not in others. And Shudra is never depicted as somebody who is at the bottom of the rung or in some way outside of social norms. Actually, Kautilya calls a Shudra an Aryan. The word Arya is used with regard to Shudra. And Shudras are generally viewed as cultivators. They live in the countryside and they are agriculturalists. So the issue is to question this. Right? I'm not going to come down in favor of one or the other, but I'm urging you to think critically about it. Then you have the second aspect of this called dvija, or twice born. Now, Sagnik mentioned a book that I edited recently called gṛhastha, or household, and I had written about the dvija previously. And let me okay. If you look at dvija, and this came as a surprise because I was trying to write an article and I thought, okay, I'll write on dvija. And to my surprise, the term dvija is absent. It's absent in all of the Vedic literature, in the Samhitas, in the Brahmanas, in the Upanishads. It's not even found in Panini or Patanjali, the great grammarians. And when we come to the Dharma Shastras, we have the first time that it occurs in the whole of Sanskrit literature. And in the earliest of the Dharma Shastras, Apastamba, the word doesn't occur. The concept doesn't occur. For the first time, it is used in the Dharma Sutra of Gautama 4 times. And then you see on your screen now how it increases in Baudhayana, in Vasishta, in Manu, 166 times, in Yajnavalkya, 40, Vishnu. So you find proliferation of this becoming the term dvija becoming a more and more central concept in Brahmanical theology. When we come to the epics, then there's a further explosion of the use. In the Ramayana, I have counted 214 times in every book of the Ramayana. And in the Mahabharata, it is just almost on every page, 1,535 times in every book of the Mahabharata. So you find very interesting development of the term dvija in the Sanskrit literature. So this, what I have given on the screen to you, dvijatinam adhyayanam ijya danam. Study, sacrifice, and giving gifts pertain to twice-born people, to dvijatis. This is the very first time the word dvija occurs in any Sanskrit literature. So this is an important moment. This is one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons that I have dated Gautama to a time after the great Mahabhashya, the great commentary on Panini by Patanjali. The dating of that text, more or less, now consensus, is the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. That's 150. 100 years after Ashoka. Ashoka was 200, that's the 3rd century. And Patanjali never uses the term, although he uses almost every other term of significance in the Brahmanical vocabulary, including Dharmashastra and Dharmasutra. So that's why I have dated Gautama to possibly the late 2nd century or even early 1st century before Christ. Okay, so question to ask then about dvija is why Brahmanical theologians, Brahmanical philosophers, such as Gautama, wanted to find a new concept, a new term, to indicate a new theology, a new institution. You don't invent a word for no reason. You invent a new word because old words are insufficient to describe something that you want to describe. Right? So you find Gautama, and after them, most of the Dharmashastra literature using the term dvija as central. So the two statements we began this talk with, that is Gavin Flood's and A.L. Basham's, saying that varnas were divided into dvija and non-dvija, you have to take that with a grain of salt, because it is at a particular time in history, in probably the late 2nd or the 1st century before Christ, that this term, this institution originated. Right? And if it originated at that time, then the question can be asked, why? Right? Why did they want to divide the upper sections of society, upper segments of society from the bottom? Right? We need to realize also at this time, and this is something that some of you have, if you deal in Indian history, may have read Professor Broncor's work on the Greater Magadha, the area around Bihar now, had talked about the coming of foreign, meaning northwestern forces into India, both the Yavanas, who were the Ionians, the leftover Greeks from Alexander the Great's invasions, and especially the people who in India were called the Shakas, and later the Kushanas, right? Outsiders coming into India. What sort of political, religious turmoil that may have created for the Brahmanical elite. And one other thing we need to realize is that the word Shudra, often used merely to indicate the lowest segment of society, is used differently by Brahmanical authors. If you read carefully somebody like Manu, Shudra is a sort of a elastic concept for Manu, even Buddhists and Jains and Kshapanakas and other sort of non-Brahmanical ascetics are viewed as Shudras. So Shudra becomes anybody who is excluded, outsider. The outsider becomes the Shudra, right? So I think that we need to keep in mind as we look at the whole varna dvija ideology. The third point I want to bring up is the term gṛhastha. Sagnik already mentioned the term and the book that I edited. Gṛhastha literally means staying at home. Grha and stha. Right? But the interesting point, and this is an important point that I had not known until about 2013, 14. That's just less than 10 years ago. Nobody knew, not only me, but others too, that the term gṛhastha, again, does not appear in any Sanskrit text before the time of the Dharma Sutras. That's the first time that it comes in. And I give here on the screen my good friend, Professor T.N. Madan from Delhi University, who wrote this wonderful book on non-renunciation. It seems legitimate to suggest that an ideology of the householder, he uses the English term householder, possibly meaning gṛhastha, exists in Indian society. Householders are not merely given empirically in defiance of the ideology of renunciation, but domesticity is also a positive value orientation, just as renunciation is. This raises the important question of the relationship between two apparently antithetical ideologies. And I think what we have discovered in the history of the term gṛhastha supports Professor Madan's thinking on householders through his research into the householders among the Kashmiri Pandits that he did long time ago. Even though the term gṛhastha is not found in early Sanskrit literature, the Vedic literature has the term grahapati, which is house lord, which is a different word, and the Dharma Sutras have the word gṛhastha. So we are asking the question, and especially my good friend Professor Stephanie Jamieson, who discovered this, had asked the question, why are there two terms? Why is gṛhastha completely overshadow grahapati? Because the term grahapati hardly ever occurs again in the Dharma-shastric literature. It is taken over by gṛhastha. So she wanted to find out, where does gṛhastha come from? It is not found in Sanskrit. And she found that actually it is found in the Prakrits. Of who? Of Ashoka. So here I give you on the screen Rock Edict 12. Devana piye piyadasi laja sarvapasandani pavajitani ghattani va pujeti danena vividhaye cha pujaye. The King Devanam Priya Priyadarshin pays homage to all Pashandas. I won't deal with the term Pashanda anymore here. It tells broadly a religious group. But Pashandas, whether Pravrajita or Grahastha, with gifts, etc. So this is the first time that we find the term Grahastha in all of India. All of Indian history. Rock Edict 3, we have a small statement. Tata vasati bhamanava, samanava, anyeva, pasanda, ghittava. Those brahmanas and shramanas or other pasandas or grahasthas who live there. And the third time it comes is in Pillar, it should be Pillar, Pilar, Edict 7. Okay. And let me put it down here. Oh, okay. Let me take it back. So those Dharma Mahamatras of mine are occupied with various kinds of activities that are beneficial both to ascetics, pravrajitas, and to householders, grāsthas. And then it continues, I have directed these should be occupied with the affairs of the Sangha, that's the Buddhist Sangha. Likewise, I have directed these should be occupied also with Brahmanas and Ajivakas. Likewise, I have directed these should be occupied also with Nirgranthas, which is the Jains. I have directed these should be occupied with various Pasandas, etc. Right? So here we have, just going back, that they have been sent to both Pravrajitas and Grihasthas. Okay, that we keep it there. So we find that the term Grihastha now is used by Ashoka, and they are sort of parallel terms. The Pravrajita are the ascetics who have gone away from home. The very term Sanskrit, Pravraj, go forth from home, and Grihastha, staying at home, the opposites. But both are given as religious lifestyles, one equal to the other, at least not distinguished from other, not one below or above the other. So that is an important point. And it is this kind of holy man who stays at home but still follows a religious path that Ashoka seems to indicate by his use of Grihastha. And this is where we get when we get to the Dharma Sutras, you find that the Grihastha is now connected intimately with this new institution of the 4 ashramas, right? 4 modes of life. Chatvara ashrama gṛhastham acharya kulam maunam vanaprastham iti. There are 4 ashramas: the Grihastha's life, living at the teacher's family, the life of a sage, and life of a vanaprastha. Similarly here, Gautama says, there is, however, a single ashrama, the teacher says, because the state of Grihastha is prescribed in express Vedic text. I'm sort of running out of time and I'm not going to be in detail, but here you find the 4 ashramas as 4 religious modes of living a holy life, is given as a Vedic student, a forest hermit, a Pravrajita, person with ascetic that Ashoka refers to, and then the Grihastha. So Grihastha is not any old man who has a family and children in a house, right? But he's a particular kind of person who is devoted to a holy life. And here in this Vasishtha's Dharma Sutra, you find the Grihastha elevated above all the ashramas, above even the ashrama of a ascetic or Pravrajita. Grihastha alone offers sacrifices, and Grihastha performs austerities. Of all the 4 ashramas, the Grihastha is the best. As all rivers and rivulets ultimately end up in the ocean, so people of all ashramas ultimately end up in the Grihastha. As all living beings live dependent on their mothers, so all mendicants live dependent on the Grihastha. So you find this interesting newness coming here. The term dvija we saw, the term gṛhastha we are seeing now, and the term varṇa is much older, but again need to contextualize it in terms of ideology. My final, and I will be brief here, is looking at 3 common concepts of ancient Indian religion: moksha, punarjanma or rebirth, and karma. If you look at any text on ancient Hinduism, these 3 things are presented as the cornerstones and the foundations of all these texts. But the issue is, when did this concept come into being? Right? Johannes Bronkhorst, and I'm giving this on your slide here, in Greater Magadha, claims they are defining elements of the Magadhan culture, from which they spread to Greater India. If that is true, how do we explain their absence in the most central of Magadhan texts, the Ashokan inscriptions? Because these four concepts are absent completely. Again, we are back to the silencers, right? Why is Ashoka silent on them? Some people may say, well, he didn't have any reason to talk about it. But he did, because he talks a lot about living a life devoted to Dharma. And by doing so, he says, you will attain a better situation after death. And that situation, Ashoka constantly refers to as going to heaven. Heavenly life is what awaits you when you do Dharma. Nothing is said about moksha, and especially about karma and rebirth, because what better ideology, what better religious doctrine is there to make people perform Dharma, keep to a moral life? What better than to say that if you do not, then you will be reborn through your karma in a very bad situation, right? Either in hells or as animals or even plants. But he never said that. He never says that. And of course, we can ask why. There could be some people say, well, he didn't know about it. Well, why didn't he know about it? Because he says over and over again that he was a Buddhist. And moksha and karma are central concepts in Buddhism. Samsara is a central concept in Buddhism. Did Buddhism not have those concepts at that time? Very difficult to imagine that. Buddhism emerges in Ashoka's writings as a mature religion with mature doctrines and scriptures. My own view, and with this I will end here, is that I think that these concepts, as Professor Bonkost notes, was very much ideology that is based in this, what Ashoka calls pashandas, that are limited or that were mostly in the Magadhan region. That is Jains, Ajivakas, Buddhists. They were all from that region that we call today Bihar. And Ashoka wanted his Dharma preaching, his Dharma philosophy to be universal, to go across the landscape of India and into actually countries beyond India. And he probably thought that these local doctrines may not be the best way to preach his doctrine to others outside. So with that, I will end with this thought that writing history, especially of ancient Indian history, is a very difficult task. One needs to look at your sources carefully, look at where they're coming from, look at who is writing, what are the biases that are implicit or explicit in them before trying to do the construction that we do when we write history. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome.
So I will see if there are any questions still. Nobunil, is there any question there? If not, then I will. You are muted, Nobunil.
Okay, I will just ask ask the audience to post their questions or comments. If they have any questions or comments, please do post your questions in the comment section box. We will have a short question answer session. And before that, I would like to hand over to Shagnik if he has any question or comments regarding
So,
Sir's lecture.
so I would like to initiate this with a very half-baked question, if I may. Is that when we are talking about Ashoka's universality, he is trying to make the dharma universal and saying that the Pashandas are everywhere, even if they are not like the Buddhist giants or Jivikas in other places. So, what I get from Professor Joel Brereton's work that he tried to synthesize the core from the diverse religious beliefs and made his own dharma as an ethical parameter. But then at the similar time, you were saying that the new kind of dvija and all these hierarchicized concepts are coming in, and eventually the Ashokan inscriptions do succumb into a kind of a forgetfulness in one sense due to that time, if I'm correct in that sense. But I do not want to also believe into that, and then I want to know that how Ashoka's idea of dharma did interact with the later development with the concept of dharma and also the other concepts forward, if there is at all you can shed light on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So Ashoka's concept of dharma, Ashoka's concept of Pashanda, okay? He thinks of Pashanda as a very broad. It is very interesting because we have a contemporary understanding of the term Pashanda that Ashoka uses. In the Greek translation we have in Kandahar, right? The Greek translation of Pashanda uh, is diatribe. Diatribe has many meanings. We don't know exactly where it is, but it sort of tells you about a philosophical ethical school, right? Not necessarily somebody who has gone out of his house into the wilderness and lived as a pravrajita. That is one form of being a Pashanda. There are many others. And he says at one point, there is no land in the whole world, including the Greeks, where Pashanda is not found, right? Right. So Pashanda is a much broader concept than Pravrajita, right? And that is where I think gṛhastha comes in, because gṛhastha may be somebody who is devoted to holiness, to a theology, but lives at home, which may be the way people in the West Asian countries did, right? Yeah, so clearly it is different. It is different. Ashoka's dharma, of course, is I'm right now just finished writing what I call a portrait of Ashoka as philosopher king. It's a sort of a biography, but based solely on the inscriptions. It will be published next year, I think, by HarperCollins of India as part of Professor Ramachandra Guha's uh, 40 volume series called Indian Lives, biographies of major Indian. And what I try to show there is at the beginning, if you look at the first minor inscription of Ashoka, it is a Buddhist inscription. He calls himself a Buddhist. He uses the technical term upasaka to refer to himself. Um, and it is very clear that his early preaching at that time was, if he had kept it up, he would have fit the later Buddhist hagiographical description of Ashoka as a Buddhist king. But he was not so. And I try to argue that there was a pivot at some point early in his life, after he has written the first minor rock inscription, but before he goes into the major rock inscription series, where he goes from being a preacher of Buddhism to be a preacher of Dharma, right? And then how he then develops this new non-sectarian supra-sectarian, you could call, right, view of dharma. This is where I have one part of this called Ashoka, the ecumenist, the ecumenical spirit, where all Pashandas should cooperate with regard to this higher calling. And you say, and the epilogue of my book deals with the forgetfulness you're talking about. Within a generation after Ashoka's death, his empire disintegrates. He's forgotten. And all the rivalries of Pashandas that he was trying to manage come to the foreground, right? The Brahmins with the Dharma Shastras, Buddhists with their scriptures, etc. Yes. So Ashoka's Dharma thing was a failed experiment in Indian history. Yet, I think it has important lessons for all of us, even for contemporary India and contemporary world, right? Just because he was ahead of his time doesn't mean that his message is irrelevant to what we are doing. And I think there are certain aspects of later Dharma concept, both in Buddhism and Dharma, that has resonances, echoes of what Ashoka was trying to say, right? Ashoka, for example, the centrality of ahimsa. He never uses the term ahimsa. He uses the term vihingsa or vihingsati, right? Right? It means more or less the same thing, right? Patanjali uses that interesting term to refer to basically describe a Sanskrit compound. And he uses the term Shaka Parthiva. Shaka is vegetable, Parthiva is king, vegetable king. So he asked, how can a king be a vegetable or a vegetable be a king? So we have to now understand this compound differently. Okay. Then he says this is the Madhyama Lopa Samasa. A samasa, a compound where the middle word is elided. It should be Shaka Bhoji Parthiva, a vegetable eating king. But I'm sure every Indian king in the ancient time, as I say, if that king listened as a boy to his mother, would have eaten vegetables, right? So what makes particular king a Shakabhoji? So which would mean it doesn't that he just eats vegetable. It's like today's term vegetarian, which means you eat only vegetables, right? So it should have a meaning such as that. And clearly, in most likelihood, this is an epithet that was given to Ashoka. And look at the vegetarianism history of India. Okay. And the centrality of ahimsa with regard to dharma. In Ashoka never compromises on ahimsa. Even when he is writing in Kandahar, where I'm sure people, that did not have that ethical basis that you should not eat meat, right? Even there, he uses the term and making it the first ingredient of his concept of dharma, right? So this is something that we find in later times. So yeah, there are many strands which you can take back to Ashoka and his newly developed theory of ahimsa. And also later on, we have even in Brahmanical texts, right? The sadharana dharma, the dharma that is applicable to everybody, right? Whether you are a Shudra or a Brahmin. So those are the kinds of things that you can think about here.
So we have a question from Conrad. Conrad, listener. So here's the question, sir.
Shall I read it for you, sir?
I can read.
আমার মনে হয় যে কোশ্চেনটা ইনকমপ্লিট আছে শাকিনিকে, একটু দেখ শেষটা, আমার মনে হলো পড়ি।
I think he's not finished with his
Question.
Yeah, it's
question there.
okay, okay. Also a big domain where there's a Kannad. Okay, I know Kannad well. Kannad is a friend. Um, yeah, I don't know where he's going. Yes, uh, I think I know the question now. Yes, uh, I would not use those words to translate those Sanskrit terms, um, and I can excuse these people because they were writing for an audience that had no insight into the original. So you are trying to use terms where they may be comfortable in. Um, and with regard to using terms that come from Europe, yes, it is a problem. It's a problem we have to be cognizant of. But if you're going to translate Sanskrit into English, and English being a language that had its birth in Europe through the European experience of feudalism, Christianity, and all that, willy nilly, you are going to use terms that are at some level anchored in that past. So I'm more generous to them. I have a generous spirit. The problems of translation, I think, but we can do better than what Van Buitenen and Flood have done. We can do better. But whatever we do, we still have that problem. Often we don't think about it because those English terms that we use to translate are familiar. Because they are familiar, we think that's okay. That's okay. But if you go a little deeper, those words are also problematic. Let's take a simple word like religion. Religion has a long, deep history in Europe before it became a universal term going to India and everywhere else, right? There is no parallel term in any Indian language, right? So the term we use as religion, we are imposing a particular category on the history of India. Right? I'm not saying that is illegitimate, but we have to be cognizant of that. That's all I'm saying. Because any kind of scholarly category we use is always manufactured, is always created, and it breaks up the seamless tapestry that is a culture or a thing, right? But that is necessary. So I'm a little bit more generous maybe than Kannad is, but yes, that is a problem that every translator deals with, right? Uh, for example, Kannad has been working on this wonderful Sanskrit term called Anrashangsya, right? Anrashangsya. There is no real word in English that can translate that, right? Whatever word you use is inadequate in some way or other. It overemphasizes some aspects of it, or downplays other aspects of it, etc. So it's all translation is a very. The Italians had a good word. Italians had a expression called traduttori sono traditori. Translators are traitors. They are traitors to the original, right? So translators are always a problem. Yeah, and I agree with Kanad.
Is there any other question, Nobonil? If not, then Professor, can I ask the last one maybe?
Yes, you can.
Yeah. So I was thinking that when we are talking about Dharma Sutras and Shastras, especially Dharma Sutras, and coming up with the concepts like dvija and then Shudras, and you said that it's an elastic term which does encompass all the outsiders per se. I was thinking of another term when you were talking about this, that is Chandala.
Uh-huh.
And we know that this term, I mean, there are communities in the real world who had been designated in by that name, but they had been pitted against both in some part of Buddhist literature, even in Jatakas, and some part of even the Sutras and Shastras, Dharma literature, let's say, against the Brahmins in some way or the other. So in Buddhist literature, in different way, where the Sudras are admonishing the Brahmins, and in the Shastric literature, of course, the
Yes.
other way around. So
Yeah.
can you just shed a light on the Chandala as a concept? If
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, your former professor, Parasha Sen has done work on precisely that in terms of the outsider, right? The mlecha. So those are terms that we have in the language, which are not categories, but imprecise. Well, I guess it's a category, but not a category that is precisely defined. A category that is elastic, that may have included particular communities that were either self-identified as Chandala or described by outsiders as Chandala, more likely, right? Uh, uh, but the concept was elastic enough to include others who came in, especially if it was a outsider, not insider designation, but outsider designation. Then anybody that the outsider thought, oh, that fits the Chandala category, he's a Chandala now, right? So that's the problem. So it's a real problem. So you have Chandala, it's the most common for somebody who is not a Shudra. So Chandala is outside of the Varna system, right? Then there's another term that is used quite frequently in the Dharma Shastras called Antyaja, born at the end. And that has sometimes it is just a name for a Shudra, but more frequently than not, it is a name for somebody who's completely out, like a Chandala, right? Then you have other terms coming up, Shivapacha, the dog cooker, and other community. Then, of course, you have the term Mlecha, on which Parasar Singh has written. Mlecha, again, an outsider, but possibly outsider who is speaking a different language that is not fully understandable by the mainstream of society, because they talk about Mlecha Bhasha, right? Bhasha. So the Turks could be Mlechas, the Greeks could be Mlechas, then of course the British could be Mlechas, right? So all those could be. So those are very elastic concepts, I think. I don't think, I have not seen at least study, in-depth, well-researched study of the use of the term Chandala within the ancient Indian vocabulary, both in inscriptions and in texts. And that's, I think, is a great desideratum. It's a desired object. Somebody could do it. Somebody who's younger than me. Right. Yeah. That's a important thing to remember, and not to always think that when the text says somebody is a Chandala, this is a well-identified, well-defined kind of a concept, right? Often it is merely a term, like today we use, oh, he's an atheist, right? It's a sort of a disparaging comment, right? You are that. Yeah. In Sanskrit, you have the term Nastika, right? Anybody whom you don't like is a Nastika. Right? Okay, thank
okay,
you
sir.
very much. It was very, very good to talk to you all, and I hope.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're
So
welcome.
kindly agreeing to this.
Goodbye.
So goodbye, sir. We are ending our session here now. Then Navani, please do the
Okay.
honors.
Okay. So I would like to thank Professor Patrick Olivelle for giving such a wonderful lecture, and I would always like to thank Shagnik, who is also my batchmate from President's College, for conducting this webinar. And I would also like to thank all our audiences who participated in this webinar. And before concluding, I would like to say that the entire video of the webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and it will be shared tomorrow morning to our Facebook page. And secondly, the speaker for our next webinar, that is the month of October, will be Professor Milinda Banerjee, Milinda Banerjee, and I will definitely share the details of Milinda's lecture, the date and time. But I think it will be around in the last week of October, since there are this Durga Puja, Kali Puja, and Bhaifota and other stuff. So next speaker will be Milinda Banerjee, and I think this is for the first time I'm announcing it publicly. I think in the month of January or February, we will be doing our second offline seminar, and the speaker will be Arindam Chakraborty, Professor Arindam Chakraborty, and we all are eagerly waiting for Professor Arindam Chakraborty. I think if everything goes right, it will be around in the last week of January and the first week of February. Professor Arindam Chakraborty. Okay.
That note, thank you all.
Thank you, Shaggy. Okay.
Thank you, Navan.
Thank you.